welcome back to yet another episode of the Dental Practice Launch Podcast, our startup series with Dr. Dan Dinowitz of Voorhees Pediatric Dentistry. There he is, and all of his Voorhees Pediatric Dentistry swag. We've come from, being kind of the announcement early in the episodes to now having full-on t-shirts, which I think we've had in a previous episode, but then hats are now getting added to the mix. We're full in on the branding, and I absolutely love it. And today we're going to dive into something that I often, even just as a marketing company, people ask me questions about of like, hey, do you have anybody you recommend when it comes to financing for a startup? And all of those questions. And we're going to dive into those today and some of the things that you should be looking into when looking at financing for a dental practice, specifically a startup. Some of the maybe some of the things that you should look out for, some of the things to be aware of, and then also some of those common questions that everybody has. And we're really excited to dive into that. But before we do, as usual, we want to dive in here and ask Dan a little bit about how things are coming along, where his startup is, because we're getting close, Dan. Like this is coming up, we're kind of like getting up to third base here and going to be rounding third base here soon. How's it going, man? And where are you at with things? And is it starting to, get real here?
Hey, everyone. It is. It's getting a little bit real. It's getting pretty intense. I'm not stressed at all. Just kidding. I'm a little stressed, maybe a little more than a little. So I am 2 weeks from today. I'm going to be, next week we're having final inspections. And hopefully, if everything goes well, knock on wood, then the following week I'm going to be moving in. First couple of days just to myself, and then going to start my team a few days after that. We're going to do 2 weeks of training. We're going to software training, unboxing supplies, a lot of in-services with all the equipment. And probably about a month from this day, we're going to be starting to see patients. So it is the final countdown.
So, we're about a month out now, which is just unbelievable, this whole process, this whole journey. And I know that we recently discussed a little bit about the mural that's going up in the practice. Update our audience here. How's that coming along? And maybe hopefully, when we're recording this, or this goes out to our audience, maybe we can put a screenshot or something of that and what that's looking like. But update us on that, because I know people are excited to hear about that.
Yeah, my two wonderful artist friends, Olga and Steve, they already finalized their designs. Steve is constructing the airplane that's going up. It's pretty much all the pieces are made. They just need to be brought into the space. And he also made this really nifty. Who uses that word? He really made this great light fixture, and it's going to have like a wooden square, and then some globe lights, and then there's going to be a bunch of like acrylic glass looking paper planes, because paper plane, the V. And so when the light shines through it, it's going to kind of like sparkle. And then the mural itself, which says, "You have the best smile," very positive message. That's going to actually go up in 2 weeks. So right after we move in, after all the dust settles, literally, with she's going to paint her mural, because we don't want to do that while all the equipment and stuff's going in right now.
That's so exciting. I know that's one of the things I'm most looking forward to as well. And the other thing that I wanted to kind of touch base on is you are like in the process of moving with all of this as well, right? Like where are you at as far as like actually moving to where you're going to be practicing? And where do we stand with the actual move as well?
Yeah, that's another funny part of my life. So way back when I decided I wanted to do my startup, my wife and I also came upon the opportunity to build a new construction house, which I never dreamt of doing, but the opportunity fell in our lap and we went ahead. And so it literally, everything happened in parallel through the whole year. This all started back, the office and the house journey started last June, and it's gone in like crazy parallel. The office is almost ready, a few weeks away. The house is pretty, it's on delay. It's going to be about 2 or 3 months before that is done. So we decided to get a short-term rental in the town nearby Voorhees, and we're going to just deal with it, wing it. And I wanted to be down there instead of my apartment in North Jersey because I wanted to be close for patients, start getting into the community, start just going to things, movies in the park, going to the Jersey Shore, stuff like that. So for our family, the right decision was just to get down there, even though the house was not ready.
Living out of some boxes a little bit temporarily in the rental space before moving into the final home.
There's a lot of boxes in my apartment right now. My wife. So anyone who's been following along might have seen my Instagram, Dr. Dan, your kid's dentist. My wife started her own Instagram, VPD Mama, and she's been incredible along the whole journey. And she just made this hilarious reel, unbeknownst to me. I saw it when everyone else saw it on Instagram, where she showed what our apartment really looks like right now. It's an Amazon warehouse with about 20 boxes right near the door, filled with swag, water bottles, dental equipment, curing lights, all sorts of weird stuff. Yeah.
Oh man, living the dream. This will all be. I hope you're going to remember this, document some of this, because this is all part of this story as this comes together. And one other thing, just to touch base on now that we're about a month out from actually seeing patients here, you've been doing an awesome job. As you have been from the beginning, social media, getting the word out, really promoting the practice. Obviously, we've had some coming soon, ads and things running in the community. And it seems like your VIP list is starting to grow. What's that like for people who've never owned a practice yet? What's it like when you see that, submission come in as somebody's like, hey, I want to bring my kids here. Like, that's got to be a pretty sweet feeling, I would imagine.
Yeah, it really is. Not exaggerating. It's like, I don't know. It's like finding out you won the lottery every time you get one of these little emails coming in. So for those who don't know, a VIP list is when you're a few months out from opening up your practice, you have a pre-register list. And on your landing page, your coming soon webpage, there's a place for people to register as a VIP. And they put their basic information in, and then we get a Excel spreadsheet so that we can call those people who are interested in our practice once our phones go live. And what's really helped the VIPs rolling in was part social media, but then a heavy amount of it was the marketing that my marketing agency, Crimson, Shane, and Lara, and everyone on the team, they've been helping navigate, the demographic of the area and getting just the right people to see the ads. And there's kind of a steady flow, some ebbs and flows. Like sometimes, like certain weeks, I get like 10 new families, and then some weeks it's a little slower. And then we kind of like, we talk. We have a meeting on Zoom, and we say, oh, what can we change? Maybe we need a new ad. Maybe we need to tweak it a little bit. So it's like a real living thing, this marketing piece. Yeah.
Yeah. It's so exciting just to kind of see that and see the buzz, that's happening in the community. And as you open, continuing to just build off of that momentum. And what I'm really excited for, which will again be part of our series here as you all listen along, will be our content shoot that we'll be having at the place for getting photos, videos. That's going to be a blast, and that's really going to be the highlight of Voorhees pediatric dentistry and showing how unique this space is. So I can't wait for it. But of course, before we got to where we are today, one of the most critical pieces when starting a startup practice is around securing financing, right? We've got to be able to secure financing and make sure that we're doing this in a way where we're setting ourselves up for success. And so what do? Well, we reach out to the great folks at Ideal Practices, and we got a great resource, Jesse Darby, who is helping startups navigate through the financing process and really just being kind of their tour guide and getting them set up for success, as we mentioned. So, Jesse, first off, thank you so much, man, for coming on, and would love to hear just a little bit about you and your role in helping startups achieve their dream and building their practice.
Thanks, Shane. Yeah, so I am obviously with Ideal Practices. I am the startup practice consultant on our team who is in charge of helping our clients with the financing, the funding piece. So, that's for a lot of people is not necessarily the most fun part of the process. Sometimes it can be a little scary. My goal is to get our clients comfortable, get them prepared for conversations with the bank, make sure that they're ready for those applications and going through the process. Kind of from the beginning to the end. When you think about, getting a home loan or something like that, most of the work is done at the beginning and you don't really have to worry too much about it. When you're building out a practice, it's a little bit different. You have your initial approvals, and then you're looking at budgets, you're looking at bids, making sure everything is good to go with the banks, and then making sure that you stay within budget. Things are going to change and shift throughout the process of your project and your build out. So kind of the beginning to the end of that process is what I'm helping with.
Well, we've heard just nothing but great things, Jesse, about you and the work that you've put in. And we're going to talk about today, all the different things that we need to be, looking at. What are, lenders looking at, when you're trying to get a loan, secure financing, what are some of the key, loan terms you need to be looking at, budgeting, what happens if you go over budget. We're going to talk about all of those things in this episode. Before we start in, though, one of the things we've mentioned here briefly at the beginning of the episode, Dan is just a very go-getter guy, right? And there's all these changes happening, and one of those changes you may have heard, you listeners out there, is he's building a home and where he's going to be practicing. So he hasn't been currently living where he's going to be practicing at, and that I've actually heard a few cases where people are moving in the process of building their startup. And so let's talk a little bit about that. Dan and Jesse, from your end here, I guess let's start with you, Jesse, on this. I guess it is possible, right? But how does that work when you're working on, do you build the house first? Do you get the financing for the practice first? What have you seen, and what's kind of the tip there that you would give, and what have you seen kind of play out?
Yeah. So to answer the first question, yes, it is obviously possible, right? Dan is going through that and has been going through that for the past few months. There's not necessarily a right answer to every situation as far as house first or practice first. When in doubt, I would lean practice first, right? Just because, if you can't make it work, then, you want to find out where you want to be for the practice, right? We're looking at ideal patient. That's something that's huge with our team is, finding your ideal patient and being where you want to be for the practice. So until you kind of have that figured out, you don't necessarily want to plant your roots somewhere, right? Because then, maybe that's not ideally where you want to be. But from a mechanic standpoint with the lenders and things like that, one of the questions that they will ask you initially on the applications, they'll ask you how far away, your practice will be from where you currently live. They will ask you how far your associate job is from where the practice will be. The bank wants to see you be close, right? Now, it kind of comes down to timing there as well. So like in Dan's scenario, he's working and living in North Jersey and he wants to be in South Jersey. It can be done, right? Different banks will look at it different ways, but really, as long as you have a plan, right? He was already commuting to, back and forth, north and south to make it happen, even before this whole process started. So that, the banks understand that and they know that can be done. So sometimes we can get a little bit of wiggle room there. But if you're just starting from scratch, the easy answer is practice first. But once you have figured out where you want to be, you can absolutely do the home at the same time. They're just things that you want to keep in mind there, right? The big things are how that's going to affect your liquidity, how that's going to affect your, the monthly cash flow with your mortgage payment.
And Dan, for you specifically, so obviously you picked the location, right? Of like, okay, this is where I want to practice, Voorhees, New Jersey. Can you share to the listeners who maybe might go through the same thing, kind of what that timeline looked like for you from the time you picked the location to then going about, for the house as well?
Yeah. So to, I guess, get really into the details, we came upon the opportunity. Well, I knew I wanted to work with Ideal. I had already signed on with them in like January of 2023. We spent, a couple months in the first part of the process, methodically going through the vision, doing the demographics of all the different towns that we covered in a past episode. And then while we were going through that, I came upon this opportunity to build a house in a town near Voorhees. So that happened, and we signed on the dotted line to commit towards building a house. Then, so that happened in like March or April of 2023. About 2 months later is when I went on the real estate hunt, and we covered that in a previous episode. And then once I found the space I wanted, then things with the house ramped up, and I had to make like 3 months of like really intense decisions about that. Meanwhile, everything with the office was, I don't want to say in the background, but it was being handled by Mike from Ideal and my real estate agent and my attorney. We were negotiating the letter of intent and then the subsequent lease. So that was a lot of work, but I was able to delegate a lot of that to my advisors and consultant. So it was a very weird time for my brain. I had to retrain my brain. My wife had to do it. Like, we were always like, I would come home and we're having conversations about like paint colors, and we're like, wait, what are we talking about? The office or the house? And like that joke, it was a joke, but it wasn't. Sometimes like she actually didn't know who I was and what I was talking about. And the funny thing, this is totally aside, my interior decorator for my office, we also hired as my interior decorator for our house. So we really blurred the lines between business and a house. Anyway, so what Jesse was talking about with my specific situation, building both the house and the office at the same time, it worked for me. It wouldn't work for everyone. I was in a different situation than some others. I had been already working for 10 years. I paid off all my student loans, thankfully. I had savings, liquidity. So that helped the bank look at me as a candidate deserving of their loan, even though there were some other imperfect criteria for their underwriting process.
And that's a interesting point there too, you've brought up, and we've talked about this in a previous podcast series a little bit. And Jesse, I'll tee this one up for you. As it's no secret that today's graduating dentists are graduating with more student loan debt than ever before. And so a common theme that I see in different Facebook groups and whatnot is, hey, I'm coming out of school with, over $500,000 in student loan debt. There's no shot that I'm going to, a bank's going to loan me money to start a practice. Jesse, what have you seen in that? Is there a certain threshold? I mean, I know everybody's different, but is there a certain threshold you've seen where people need to pay it down to? Will banks still loan because they see dental as, a somewhat secure business model? I'm curious what you've seen there, because I know that's going through a lot of people's heads, and people are nervous, especially new graduates right now.
Yeah, I'll preface that by saying banks do love to loan to dentists. Dentists are great borrowers. So when we look at student loan balances, some banks are better than others at just looking at the balances, but as far as paying down a balance, that's usually not a great idea, because if you're fresh out of school and you have a lot of student loan debt, you probably don't have a lot of liquidity to go along with that, right? So when we're talking about getting approvals from the banks, it's very common for $500,000, $600,000, $700,000. They take into account, are you a general dentist or are you a specialist of some kind? Obviously, that can come with a higher number, right, that the bank would be a little more comfortable with. But we're seeing approvals coming through all the time for folks with over $500,000 of student loan debt. Really, the big thing when it comes to the student loans, everything with these lenders is about cash flow, right? So when they're not that they don't care about the balance, but it's more about the monthly payment, right? So it may be tempting, say if rates go down really low, to refinance that, right? To refinance your student loan debt if it's federally held, but stay on IBR, the income-based repayment plan. Keep that payment as low as you can if you're thinking about doing something like this, because it's just going to keep the monthly payment low and help keep the cash flow numbers work, which cash flow is everything when we're talking about, working with the lenders, whether, for a startup or anything else.
Yeah, that's good insight. And I think that is a really nice segue into choosing a lender. Where should dentists start when looking at who they choose? I've heard everything from, I tried to choose, some one that was more local, based to me. I've heard some going the big bank route. I've heard some that, I've heard specifically do a lot of financing around, dental practices and different healthcare. What are some things that people should look at when they're, interviewing or looking at choosing a lender for their startup practice?
You always recommend to start with someone who is dental specific. Most of the referrals that we're giving to our clients are for dental specific lenders, not just dental specific, but also startup specific lenders, right? So, these are mainly the national lenders who have specific departments that are just for startups, right? They understand the cash flow of a startup and they've kind of tailored their whole programs around that. Things like interest only payments on the front end, making sure that you're fully funded and you're not injecting any cash. Those are two big ones, right? Obviously, longer terms, fixed rates, very low, fees, things like that. So, for the most part, those are kind of the cream of the crop as far as, where I would start, right? If I was, looking to do financing someone who is dental specific, usually that's one of the national lenders. But now with that being said, anytime that we have a client, maybe they have a local relationship, it never hurts to ask. And a lot of times what we'll try to do for clients is try to get maybe a local bank to match some of the terms that we're getting from the bigger guys, just to see if we can make it happen. We've done that for clients, multiple times, especially if they, really value that local relationship.
Mm-hmm.
So
and Dan, we're going to get into yours specifically here in a second, some of the things that really stood out to you when choosing your lender. But you mentioned there too, Jesse, about trying to see if maybe the local bank can match some of those loan terms. What are some of those important loan terms that you should be looking at, really paying attention to when going through this process?
Yeah, and that's a great question, because 90% of people, when they first see a loan approval, the first thing they look at is probably what? The rate. And, and that's not even probably top 4 or 5 of things that should be on the top of the list necessarily when you're looking at an approval. So, the first thing I'm looking at, is it fully funding your loan? Like, you have to come out of pocket, right? We want to make sure that we can fully fund the construction, the equipment, working capital, all that stuff, right? So that you're not dipping into those personal savings. We're looking at the repayment structure. Again, cash flow is everything. So a lot of these guys are able to offer longer terms, up to 15 years for the repayment, anywhere usually from 11 to 15 years. What collateral is the bank going to require, right? Is it just a lien on the business? Sometimes, again, going back to kind of some of the banks that we don't do a lot with, it's because maybe they're going to ask you for a second mortgage on your house, or they're going to, maybe ask for a guarantor that you wouldn't have to have otherwise, something like that. What is the bank going to allow for rent? Each bank, when they run their cash flow, that's one of the reasons why we start the financing process so early with our clients. we want to see what the overall budget is, but we also want to see, when you're looking for a lease space, what rent number can work within the budget for the bank. So those are all key things that we're talking through with our clients that, are probably more important than the rate. What are the loan conditions? Is there anything crazy that the bank is going to ask you to do? Maybe one bank is requiring and another is not. And I think Dan has a good example of that from his scenario as well.
Yeah.
Yeah, Dan, please. Yeah. Share that, because this is an interesting thing that, I learned about kind of what guided your choice.
Yeah. And it's very tempting to look at the rate, especially when you don't know anything else. Everybody on the Facebook groups and the peanut gallery, they say, where do you get the best rate? But you're not going to get one bank that always has the best rate. Like, it kind of changes in the market. Big bank number one, maybe the best one this year, and then the next year not. So, also the thing about the rate, I'll kind of give away the punchline of this is, so I went with a bank that had a higher interest rate than the one that was competing for my business, and you can refinance. So hopefully, right now interest rates are still at, close to all-time high. And if, hopefully it goes down in the next couple of years, and I can refinance that. So anyway, my situation with building my house was that, so I own the apartment that I live in now, and I plan on selling it. I'm building a house that I'm not yet living in, and I don't own that yet. So bank number one that I did not go with was looking at both the house I live in and own right now and the house that I will own one day, and they were counting both of those against my my future cash flow, which I get it. There are underwriters, sometimes things are black and white in the process, but I didn't really own that future house. I always knew I was going to sell my current apartment. But anyway, so bank number one had an amazing interest rate. It was about 1.25% less than the other one that I went with. But they basically needed me to guarantee a certain amount of income. And I do have that in my current associate job. The issue is that my current associate job is up in North Jersey, and my future office is down in South Jersey, and they are more than 60 miles away, which was a number they used. They just had to draw a line in the sand somewhere. So because my office that I'm building was more than 60 miles away, in fact, it was 90 miles away, their underwriters were not able to count my current income towards my cash flow. So for that reason, I would have qualified for a loan. They would have given it to me, but they wanted me to get a co-signer. And the only person that would have done that for me would have been my parents, and they would have, but I didn't want to do that to them. So bank number two, Provide, that I ultimately went with, they had a higher interest rate. Not a terrible one, not crippling, but higher. And they did kind of look at it in a more holistic, approach. And they said, okay, this guy doesn't have any student loans. They see my liquidity, all the money that I've saved. And they gave it to me. So, and that didn't affect my interest. It would have been the same interest rate no matter what. So, yeah.
So when you decide to go that path then, and really looking at the terms, it goes right back to, Jesse, what you were saying there, where, if Dan would have just looked at the interest rate, maybe that wouldn't have been ultimately the right decision for him, right? He would have went a different route if he was just looking on that. But for you, Dan, I guess, how important was that to you for the terms that, Provide was able to provide, play on words there, but seriously, and what does that do for your, I guess, maybe just psyche, going into this and not having to, worry about a cosigner, and just for you personally, this was your scenario, your situation. how does that, you feel like, help you maybe just mentally moving forward, going into this whole process?
So, knowing that my interest there was going to be a little bit higher, we just had to do math. And Jesse was really helpful at, doing the math, with me and for me and explaining it probably about 10 times. I made him repeat himself just so that I could really absorb it, and very kind and patient. And it ultimately was like, all right, yeah, it's a little higher, but you can refinance and also you can swing it. And you're getting a much bigger amount of money. You will probably, be under budget, which I currently, near the end of the project, I am still. So there was a lot more comfort. And then the other thing about Provide was that they are known for stellar customer service. And that has rang true through the whole process. There's no 1-800 number you're calling. You got direct lines to all the reps that you're working with through the process. And I'm not being paid by them. I'm just going to say they have been amazing. Like, I email, when one of my vendors needs to be paid, I email them literally same day they get paid. Nobody's hunting down, me for money.
I can vouch for that. Yes, they're quick.
Yeah. They're also just very nice people. People that I like earlier in the process that I haven't worked with, that I frankly don't have any use for. That sounds terrible, but they still check up on me and text me like, "Hey, Dr. Dan, how you doing? Your office is looking great." Blah, so customer service matters. Yeah.
Yeah, for sure. That's a really, I think, important insight there for our listeners is, again, circling back to just not necessarily just only about the interest rate. It's you're right. First thing I think about too, when looking at, potentially getting some, a loan, whatever the case is. So I think that's really interesting. Jesse, one thing that I wanted to ask about was, when you are looking at, securing financing for a startup practice, what are some of the things that these banks are looking for? So what are the things that you're going to be looked at to determine whether or not, you're going to be able to, secure maybe the best terms, financing, all of those things. So do you have some insight there on what people can kind of expect and kind of know what to try to have in line before going out and try to secure financing?
Yeah, absolutely. And, some of the banks, they kind of refer to them as their toll gates, right? Things that kind of get you in the door, right? To show that you are ready to start the application process, to go into underwriting, to get that loan approval in place. And, the first thing, and we touched on it before, is liquidity. So really, I'm going to touch on 4 kind of main points here. The first being liquidity, right? So the bank wants to see that you have a certain amount of savings. Obviously that's going to vary depending on your situation, where you are. Maybe you're just out of school. Maybe, like in Dr. Dan's case, you've been practicing for 10 years. Everybody's different. So the liquidity piece, the bank doesn't want to take your money. They just want to see that you have that rainy day fund. And it's an indicator of your savings habits as well, right? So it's a good reflection upon you and your financial, background or habits, right? So when we're talking liquidity, again, that number is going to vary somewhere. It's usually a percentage of the practice loan amount that they want to see that you have saved. So that number can be anywhere 5 to 10% typically, again, depending on your scenario. These practice loans today, the cost of everything continues to go up, whether it's construction, equipment, any of that. So those loans are ranging anywhere usually from, $700,000, $800,000. And they can go higher than that as well. But just, use $700,000 as an example. If you wanted to, if you're just out of school, if you got $40,000 to $50,000 in liquidity, then you get a pretty good shot of getting an approval, assuming that everything else falls in line as well. Maybe you do have that $500,000 in student loans. If you're on income-based repayment, that's not going to hurt the cash flow. And that's kind of a good segue into this number 2, right? So number 1 is liquidity. Number 2 would be your credit and your debt. So, the bank's not just looking at a credit score, they're kind of digging into your credit report, seeing what kind of history you have there. But really, it's more about the monthly payments for the cash flow. So that's number 2. Number 3 and 4 kind of go hand in hand, and those would be income and production. So, you want to have some kind of an income, right, from an associateship that you can show the bank. One thing that we say all the time is at Ideal Practices is the bank will ask you, will you continue to associate in the infancy of your new practice? And the answer to that is always yes. Always yes. And Dan's probably smiling because we probably talked about this 10 times as well. But, what the bank does is they're going to use a portion of your current associate income for the first few months to help the cash flow numbers work. They're going to project your revenue for the new practice and then also give you credit for a portion of your current income for a couple days a week, assuming that you would split time between the two as you're ramping up. So that's why the answer to that question is always yes, to help you obtain an approval. So that's the income piece. That's why they want to see your income. The other side of that is the production piece. The bank wants to show that you can clinically carry the practice, right? As well as, if you're a great producer, you can also increase the revenue that they're going to project for your practice as well, just to help strengthen the approval. So those are kind of the 4 main things. So the liquidity, your credit, and then income and production. Those are the 4 things that we go through with our clients in detail very early on in the process, just to kind of make sure that they're ready to roll and ready to approach the banks.
All right, so Jesse, I know you mentioned looking at your debt, pulling kind of like your credit report, probably looking at different loans, what kind of borrower you've been in the past, all those type of things. But I do know that one common question you probably get is, do I need to have X amount or higher credit score before I go and try to get a favorable terms for a startup loan? Is there a recommendation there at all, or is it really just, individual based? But I know so many people put a lot of thought into credit scores, and just would love to get your input and your thoughts there from your experiences.
Yeah, so there are a couple pieces to that. So first of all, there's not necessarily a hard number that you have to have. You'll hear some banks talk about 680 kind of being a baseline as far as a credit score goes. It's more situational though, like you kind of alluded to there. Maybe you don't have a lot of credit at this point. Maybe other than student loans, there's not a whole lot going on at this point because you're just getting started, in your career, maybe something like that. But yeah, 680. If I had to throw out a number, that would be it. You'll hear that from the banks. But the good thing about these types of loans is sometimes with an auto loan, for example, your rate could vary depending on what your credit score is. That's not how these loans, that's not how the pricing is going to work. So you get an approval or you don't. And the rate that you get is the same rate that everyone else is getting at that time, just based on the current market, right? So it's not, hey, if you're 750 plus, then you're going to get a better rate than the other guy. Obviously, it'll help strengthen your approval, but you don't have to worry about, fractional interest rates changing or anything like that based on a credit score.
Got it. Okay. No, I think that's helpful because I do think, pretty much for most people who are doing this probably have never, taken out a loan for a startup practice. Maybe they've done it with a car before, maybe even they've done it with a house. And I think it's important to really show some of the differences there between doing this for a startup practice versus, going in and getting a new car. So that's helpful. Last piece here that I kind of want to move into is let's talk about budgeting. So, obviously with Dan's case, he's been, working with the team at Ideal, from a variety of different angles here, working with the contractors and a variety of different vendors to make sure that he's working within that budget. And how do you manage that, managing a budget throughout a project? Sometimes, you hear stories, things happen, things come up, you go over budget, whatever the case may be. What are some things that really you should be looking at when going through the budgeting for a project for a startup practice? And maybe as a follow-up to that, what happens if you're not as lucky as Dan and you go over budget? can you make adjustments? Would love to just hear some insights on budgeting.
So the budgeting process really starts from the very beginning. With us, with our clients, when you're getting that initial approval, you're really guessing on a lot of the budget numbers at that point. Because like I said, we like to start with our clients. We start the process really early for financing, just because we want to make sure that we have that clear path for funding before we go out to start to negotiate on real estate. And also, like I said before, it's going to give you an idea of your budget. It's also going to give you an idea of your rent amount that'll work within the approval, which if that doesn't work, nothing else really matters, right? If you can't get that to work with the bank's cash flow. So you're using kind of generic numbers, honestly, at the beginning, if you don't have a space in mind yet, which most of the time you probably don't. Sometimes, clients will. But, you're throwing out some generic numbers. If you got a $700,000 loan, maybe it's $400,000 for construction, $200,000 for equipment, $100,000 for working capital, right? You're submitting your application to the bank. That's what you get your approval based on. Just know that those numbers will change, right, throughout the process. Once you find a space, maybe the square footage is larger than you had initially anticipated. So you think your construction costs are going to be higher. There's so many factors that go into that, even after your loan is open with the bank, you've signed a lease and your loan is open, that you will be shifting those numbers around at some point. So if everything, in Dan's case, Dan made my job pretty easy. If I'm being honest, we had some stuff, we had a lot of good conversations, but as far as like setting himself up for this financially, he did a really good job, he and Michelle. So, that there are always going to be some things that pop up. But in his case, like you mentioned, we're fortunate to be within the budget. One thing I like to mention about these loans as far as budgeting goes is get the highest approval amount that you can on the front end. You're only going to use or end up paying back what you use, right? So, if you get approved for $800,000, you only use $750,000. That's great. You don't have to sweat out those last few weeks, trying to make sure that everything's going to come in within budget. Everybody's getting paid. So yeah, we can be very nimble, and the banks can be nimble throughout the process. Like if you're, you get your bids back, right, for your construction, that's always kind of the biggest linchpin of the whole budget. It's the biggest chunk that's in there, right? So if that number's higher than you expected, go back. We'll go back to the bank and say, hey, here's the bid that we received. Here's why this is justified. Let's ask for an increase in the approval amount. So that's something that we can always do, whether it's, again, changing those kind of buckets, if you will, that the bank has between construction, equipment, or just increasing the amount overall.
Is that what you found too, Dan, on your side, is just kind of try to get the highest amount that they'll give, even if you're not going to use all of that? Is that kind of the route that you found that to work best for you all as well?
Yeah, I mean, it's been nice having been approved for a higher amount. It gave me that cushion, but it's hard to budget. So Ideal provides you this budgeting tool. It's a really well thought out spreadsheet where you can input, what you're spending, on anything from attorney fees and accounting fees to interior design, construction, everything in between, marketing fees. And it's sometimes hard to figure out where you're supposed to put certain items. Like you don't know if something fits into furniture or equipment, and there's like sometimes blurred lines, and these things matter. It's not just like a categorization, because you kind of want to figure out like if you're running out of money in this bucket and if you have to take some from that one. The other thing that I am running into right now is while I've had a very good experience with my bank, just the nature of how these loans work is working capital, which means the cash that you have left over, or that is reserved, not left over, but that's reserved for like what you're going to use to keep you afloat for when you open up. During the project itself, you get a smaller chunk of that working capital upfront to spend on ancillary small things that are like under a few $1,000, uniforms that you're buying early, different decorations and stuff like that. So I did find that I went through that very quickly, and then I had two options. I could either fund things myself from my personal savings and then pay myself back once I got the rest of these working capital after the project's complete, or I could have worked with the bank. They did have this option, and they could have unlocked some of those other working capital funds. But that comes at a cost of unlocking those funds early. When you unlock money early, what happens? You start paying interest. Interest starts accruing on any money that is unlocked for you. I didn't want to do that. I didn't want to pay interest on money that I didn't have to, because I was lucky enough to have cash savings. So I've spent a nice chunk of personal money that I'm going to pay myself back after, I start making money. I just got to keep a track of it. And so I use the budgeting tool column to keep a track of my personal capital infusions as well.
I think having a budgeting tool like that, it's got to be kind of a game changer for someone who's never had to do that before, right? It's like, I'm trying to think of what people would do if they didn't have a resource like that provided to them. Like, how in the world do you stay organized? How do you project, like, I took an accounting class in college, and it was the worst, right? It was like the absolute worst for me, just the type of person I am, and how my mind works. And so I think that that's a really interesting insight that you're giving there, Dan, is, these are things that you've got to be making sure that you're keeping track of and really projecting out in an accurate way. And that's where I just come back to, listen, if you can, it's a great thing about, an Ideal Practices and different groups who do this, and this is all they do, because you don't know what you don't know. You know what I mean? And so you have to have somebody in your corner who's been there, who's been through the process, knows, the blind spots, what you should be looking out for. Otherwise, I think that's where people get in trouble, right? As they try to do shortcuts and then realize, that maybe wasn't such a great idea. So really interesting when it comes to just that in and of itself, just budgeting and projecting out. Jesse, as we wrap this up, because this has just been fantastic, but if you had to say, if one piece of advice, if we, our listeners considering a startup, they've been listening to this, and they're writing down, all right, liquidity, debt, credit, income, production. They're getting kind of their notes here together. What's kind of like a final words of wisdom that you would give to somebody considering doing a startup, and when it comes to financing and finding the right lender or whatever it may be? Is there kind of one just little piece of advice, overview, that you would give them as they start that journey? Besides,
Tell the bank that you will continue to associate, right?
That's a key. We're going to mark that, right? That's the key insight.
That's a big one. That's a big one. No, I would say just go for it. I mean, I think there's a lot of apprehension out there. People can be afraid at times of the financing piece. And like you mentioned, hey, I have all these student loans. There's no way I'm ever going to get approved. Like, just have a conversation with someone, whether it's our team or someone who's been through it, and don't let that be, the fear of the unknown. Don't let that stop you from pursuing this, because, we say all the time, there's always going to be a path, whether that's a path today or that's a path a year or two down the road, whatever that's going to look like for your own personal situation, like, we'll make it happen. So just don't let anything negative that you hear or any preconceived notions that you have about, the feasibility of it, don't let that get in your way. Just do it.
And Dan, what advice would you give after going, through this process, not only going through it with your practice, but going through it with a home as well? I'm sure you're going to recommend everybody build a home and a practice at the exact same time. I'm sure that's your number one takeaway here. But no, as you've gone through this journey, yourself, maybe what's something you would tell a colleague who's considering, going down this path, and maybe a little words of wisdom for after going through it?
You got to become comfortable with becoming uncomfortable. It's a risk It's not I mean, it's a risk to start a dental practice, but it's not. Like, dental practices default on their financial loans less than 1% of the time. In pediatrics, apparently less than 0.3% of the time is a number I heard very recently. So these are calculated risks. Smart people, like the fine people at Ideal, they will, share with you that insight and, let you know, it's not going to be easy. It's hard as hell. I'm right now just like close to ripping my hair out with all the crazy responsibilities going on, but it's worth it for sure. It's been really exhilarating.
You mentioned it, Dan. It's one of my favorite quotes too. Comfort zone is a beautiful place, but nothing ever grows there. And that's something that I constantly. I did not make that up. I saw it. It was a meme or something probably I saw online, but it really resonated, and I think that's a really good point there too. And I know you're just chopping at the bit to start doing dentistry in your practice, right? It's like, let's start doing dentistry. Let's start meeting these patients. Let's start building, continuing to build from where we're at. And certainly you've got the foundation and the groundwork there to make that happen. Jesse, can't thank you enough for coming on here, sharing your insights with us. Again, something here that people is critical in getting your whole project started. So really thank you again for giving the insights. We'll of course be linking down below some of the information here that Jesse gave, some of the tips. Of course, be linking to Ideal Practices if you need to reach out to them with any questions that you may have around opening a dental startup. And of course, Dan, be sure to go follow him on Instagram as well, on the socials. He's always posting out some great content, and you definitely want to follow his account. It is well worth it. And of course, Crimson Media, we are here to help you with your dental startup when it comes to your marketing and growing your practice. So be sure to give us a follow and subscribe to the podcast if you haven't already. Like, come on, this has been great, right? Revealing the curtain of the good, the bad, the scary, the ugly of opening a practice. And so hopefully everybody gets some value out of this and gets motivated from it too. But gentlemen, can't thank you both enough. And we'll be doing it again on another episode. Dan, I'll see you soon, man.
Been great, guys. Thank you.
Have a good day.